Welcome to the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics, NCSM, Leadership in Mathematics podcast. NCSM is an organization supporting mathematics education leadership at the school, district, college, university, state, province, and national levels. Its membership constitutes an international force collaborating to achieve excellence in mathematics education. Be sure to visit the NCSM website at mathedleadership.org. This is the opening session from the NCSM 2009 Annual Conference on Monday, April 20th, 2009. The keynote speaker was Katy Haycock. Her title of her talk is Improving Achievement and Closing Gaps Between Groups, Lessons from Schools and Districts on the Performance Frontier. She provided an overview of achievement trends at the national and state levels, focusing particular attention on mathematics. Ms. Haycock is introduced by Conference Chairperson Susan Beal.
I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker. Katy Haycock is one of the nation's leading child advocates. She is president of the Education Trust, and every week the Education Trust has an education issue that brings you up to date. They publish reports that you can download. It's just a wonderful resource for us to find out what's happening. I would like to introduce you and thank you so much for coming.
Good morning to all of you. You know, I'm enough of an educator to know that most of you didn't come to this conference to hear somebody from Washington. You basically came together for these several days to do what's really most important, and that is to share with each other, to learn from each other about sort of what works, especially when you face difficult circumstances. When you're coaching a fourth grade teacher and you realize her mathematics knowledge is weak, what do? What works? When you're a department chair of mathematics in a high school and your most senior member knows a heck of a lot about mathematics but doesn't think most kids can learn it, what do? Now, those are the questions that you've come here to talk about. But one of the things that we've learned is that sometimes when you focus really narrowly on what's in front of you, it's easy to lose sight of the larger context in which you're doing your work. So what I want to do with you for the next 45 minutes or so is pull you outside of your context, outside of your schools, your districts, even your states. And we're going to take a little walk together. We're going to look at a whole bunch of data on what happens to different groups of kids as they take the journey from kindergarten on toward college. We'll talk a little bit about the problems and patterns that you see in the data, but most of all, what I want to do is share with you what we're learning from the schools and school districts across the country that are tackling those problems head on and getting better results. What, in other words, do we now know that it's going to take to both raise overall achievement, but also to close once and for all these gaps between groups that have haunted us as a country for so long? So let's take a look at the data, and I want to start actually with some good news. Those of you who know the national data know it's actually been a while since we had good news. During the 1970s and 80s, we made a lot of progress as a country in raising achievement, especially among low-income kids and kids of color. But right around 1990, that progress literally stopped dead in its tracks. And all throughout the 1990s, the gaps between groups were actually widening. Here's the good news. What you're looking at there is our results on the NAEP long-term trends reading exam for fourth graders. This is, I think most of you know, is the longest standing, unchanged exam we've given in this country. 8th grade. As all of you know, the results are a little bit more mixed. This is a look at 8th grade reading over time. As you can see there, not much to write home about. Better news in 8th grade mathematics, where again we're seeing improvements for all groups of kids and record performance for all groups of kids. And as I suspect most of you know, we're seeing that same pattern on what's called the main NAEP exam as well. That's an exam that's been given since about 1990. This is a look at 4th grade mathematics over time for all kids, for different groups of kids. And again, what we're seeing is what we all want to see, right? Which is progress for all groups of kids, faster progress for the groups of kids that have been behind. And very much the same pattern as you can see here in 8th grade mathematics. And you know, one of the things that I realize happens even in mathematics, where we really have seen some really significant progress in the last few years, is you can still be out at a meeting and you hear somebody, sometimes it's a local business leader, saying, you know, I'm really tired, we're spending more and more money on education, but the results are just flat. The next time somebody says that to you, I suggest you show them this. This is a look at 4th grade mathematics results 10 years ago. Just a quick clue to what you're seeing. Wherever you see red, those are the kids about whom we need to worry a lot. They're performing at the below basic level, means they're not even close. Green kids, by contrast, are doing just fine. They're proficient or advanced. Yellow, someplace in between. So let's concentrate on African American kids. 10 years ago, about 3/4 of those kids at 4th grade were trapped at the below basic level, only 3% proficient or advanced. Let's fast forward to today. Numbers at the below basic level cut in half, meanwhile a 5-fold increase in the number of kids performing at the advanced and proficient levels. And you see the same pattern when you look at the data for low-income kids. Numbers at that below basic level cut in half, meanwhile a 3-fold increase in the proportion of kids at the proficient or advanced level. And very much the same thing as you can see in 8th grade. That, of course, was a result of all of your efforts. You might actually even consider giving yourself a round of applause, right? Everybody in this room knows that these results don't come from just a little more drill and practice. These results come from good teaching. And the fact of the matter is your results are clearly paying off. And those of you who look at the data when your state's NAEP results come out know there's very powerful messages too for many of you in your states. Over the last 7 years, for example, Georgia educators cut the number of students performing at the below basic level more than in half, from 43% to only 21%. Hey, Georgia, all right. Ohio cut the number of African American kids below basic from 62% to 33%, while Virginia cut the numbers from 56% to 27%. Rhode Island cut the number of Latinos below basic from 71% to 38%. Louisiana has had a stunning amount of success, especially in the 8th grade, cutting the number of low-income kids at the below basic level from 68% to 47% in just 7 years. Arkansas has reduced the number of students below basic by 16 points overall and by 27 points for African Americans. Speaking of Arkansas, is there Arkansas educators in this room? Woo! That state was the biggest gainer of all in 4th grade math since 2000, up 22 points. That, by the way, is about 2 full grade levels of improvement. Arkansas educators were the second biggest gainer in 8th grade mathematics, and in the top 5 gainers at both the 4th and 8th grade level for African American and low-income students. A stunning record of success for a state that's really focused. And when you've got time to look at these a little more closely, take a look at the very powerful messages for some of you in states that have really focused on this improvement effort. Again, this is 4th grade mathematics improvement overall. The big leaders, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Hawaii, Maryland, and New York. Again, almost 2 full grade levels improvement in 7 years. 8th grade mathematics gains, again, Massachusetts, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Maryland. African American results. California, anybody from California here? You never get good news and improvement. Here you go. Here you go. #1 in the country for improvement for African American kids. And again, for Latinos, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Kansas, very big growth. At 4th grade, Massachusetts, Nebraska, Wyoming, very big growth at 8th grade. So again, when you come back and look at those a little more closely, take a look at the messages, because really, remember what's important here. When your results go up on your state test, people go, they're just teaching to the test. When you get simultaneous information that your NAEP results are improving, there's really powerful evidence that you can say, look, our kids, in fact, are learning more mathematics. But again, the bottom line, I hope, is very clear. What we're learning is when we really focus on something as a country, when we focus on something as a profession, the fact of the matter is we make progress. And those of you who've had a chance to study the history of American education certainly know that if there's one message from our history, it's actually that one. When we really focus on something, we make progress. Now, in focusing on the progress, especially at the elementary and middle school level, I don't want to suggest that there's not a lot that remains to be done. Everybody in this room who's working at the high school level is very much aware there's still a lot of kids who are entering high school without even close to the knowledge and skills we know they need to succeed. But at least we have some traction on that problem. And when you look at successive years of data, what we're seeing is more and more kids in the green category, fewer and fewer kids in the red category. In other words, we've got some traction on that problem. The same, unfortunately, is not true of results in our high schools. What you're looking at there is reading achievement at the end of high school over time. As you can see, that line is not headed in the direction we like it to head. What that's telling us is our kids are exiting high school with weaker skills in reading than their counterparts had 20 years ago. Now, when you turn over to mathematics, at first blush you say, well, at least our high schools are getting better at something, right? Because kids, in fact, are exiting high school with stronger skills in math than ever before. However, before you give too much credit for that improvement to our high schools, it's important for you to know that one of the things we can do with the national data is we can look at growth that kids are making during different parts of their educational experience. Here's a look at growth from beginning to end of high school in mathematics, knowledge, and skills. Class of 90, 94, 96, move over to 2000, what do you see? Essentially, as we were moving through the decade, what was happening is our kids were growing less and less in mathematics during their high school years than ever before. Now, some of you are saying, well, wait a second, how could those two things both be true? It's because all of those improvements in mathematics, knowledge, and skills at the end of high school actually occurred not because of improvements in our high schools, but rather because of stronger skills that kids were bringing with them up from elementary school. Our high schools nationally have responded to those better prepared students at entry by essentially growing them less than ever before. And those gaps between groups that I showed you narrowing at the elementary school level and narrowing at the middle school level, not at the high school level, as you can see here in both reading and in mathematics, gaps separating poor kids from middle class kids and kids of color from white kids are actually wider today than they were back in 1990. So the question, of course, is why? Why are we making so much progress in our elementary schools and so little in our high schools? Now, I will tell you, if this was an audience only of high school people, you would, of course, be looking at me with some pity at this point and saying, well, of course, you moron, they're high school students. Their hormones are raging, their iPods are blaring, they're thinking about everything except for academics. But what's the problem with that hypothesis? The problem, pretty simply, is if it's primarily about hormones, then you would expect to see roughly the same pattern in other countries where kids presumably have at least roughly the same set of hormones that our kids do. But those of you who have looked at the international data know that what you very consistently see is kids growing more during their secondary school years than our kids do. Now, you've all looked at the results for TIMSS in particular many of the time, and you see at grade 4 and grade 8, we're pretty much middle of the pack amongst developed countries. But when you look up at the PISA exam, which is given in high school, results are a little bit more worrisome. Now, the first time we got that wake-up call was back in 2000 when the results of the first PISA exam were administered. And basically, what we learned then is that out of the 26 countries whose kids participated in that exam and the next two, our kids ranked 17th in mathematics, 13th in science. Now, the good news is they gave the exam again in 2003. The bad news is our relative ranking declined. They gave it again in 2006, and unfortunately, our relative ranking declined once again. Now, given the importance of mathematics, both to you and to our kids' future, I want you to take a little closer look at all the countries whose kids outperform our 15-year-olds in mathematics. And as you will see when you look more closely at this, it is not just Japan and Korea and all those places where people say, well, what do you expect, right? They have the math gene. It is pretty much all of what we think of as a truly developed world. Now, a lot of educators, when we use the international data, say, you know, it's not fair. And we always say, well, what do you mean it's not fair? And they say, well, it's not fair to compare American schools to the schools in other countries because, after all, we're America, right? And we try to educate all of our kids, and in those other countries, they only educate some. Well, that, of course, used to be true. For decades, the U.S. led the world in the proportion of our kids who we got through a high school diploma. Now, however, we rank about 17th, and virtually all the countries that outperform us are actually educating more of their kids in high school than we are. Well, then people say, well, it's not fair then because we have more children who live in poverty or we have more diversity. But the fact of the matter is, when you look honestly at the data, there is no way that we can blame our poor performance just on poor kids, kids of color, or the schools that serve them. If you ask the question, for example, what proportion of our kids are getting to the highest international achievement level in mathematics? That's called level 6. Yellow there is the international average. Red is how many of our kids get there. Well, some of you are saying, well, that might be true, but I read someplace that we have the best top 5% in the world. Guess what? That's not true either. Yellow is the international average for the top 5% of every country. Red is where our top 5% is. Now, I can see from your worried faces, some of you are thinking, what about our personal children, right? Well-educated parents at home, all those educational extras. Surely they're doing better than their counterparts in other countries. Nope. Yellow is the international average for the children of well-educated parents. Red is where our children are. So literally, no matter how you cut the data in mathematics, our kids are not doing well. And frankly, the problems are not limited to something like mathematics. If you think, for example, about something like problem solving, right? We would probably say as a country, if we have a strong gene, it's the problem solving gene. Our history as a country is full of problems that we have tackled and solved. But if you ask me to show you where are we now in terms of problem solving ability, 24th out of 29 in the developed world. Now, those of you who know us as an organization can imagine that data like this are a particular challenge. Because while we are probably known for being the organization that is most honest in describing problems in American education, we are also known as the good news guys. No matter where we're working, whether it's at a community level or state level, we're always looking for something they rank high on, something they do well. So you can imagine our team of analysts looking desperately through the international data, trying to find something the U.S. ranks high on. But we can only find one thing, and it's probably not something we're very proud of ranking high on because it's the inequality of our results. Despite what I just showed you about our top kids not doing so well compared to the top kids in other countries, the gap between our top kids and our bottom kids is amongst the largest in the developed world. We have the 8th largest gap in the world in mathematics, 6th largest problem solving, and when you look at the gap between poor and middle class kids in science, 4th largest gap in the developed world. So let's talk about that gap. There's not a person in this room who's not very much aware, when you look at your data, whether you're looking at classroom data, school data, district data, or state data, the gap that you see there typically began before kids even arrived at the schoolhouse door. All of us certainly know that in this country, there are every year kids who arrive at school already behind. Sometimes that's because of poverty, sometimes that's because of language issues, sometimes that's a result of family issues, but regardless of reason, we all know a significant number of kids arrive at school already behind. So, okay, the question for us is, knowing that, how do we organize our educational system in response? And what you learn when you look honestly at that question is that rather than organizing our educational system in this country to ameliorate that problem, we actually organize our educational system in this country to exacerbate that problem. How do we do that? We do that very simply. We take the kids who come to school with less, and what do? We turn around and give them less in school too. In fact, it turns out that we give children who arrive at school behind less of everything, and I mean everything, that both research and experience tells us makes a difference. But when they don't perform so well on standardized tests, who do we blame it on? We blame it on the kids, we blame it on the parents, we blame it on the culture, we blame it on the race. We never, ever talk about what we've done. So how does that happen in the United States of America? How can we create a system that is so heavily rigged against different groups of kids? Well, some of those lessons, as I suspect all of you know, flow from choices that policymakers make, including the choice that many state legislatures have made to just plain spend less on the education of some children than they spend on the education of others. And what you're looking at there on the screen shows you how those choices made by policymakers play out for the country as a whole. So some of this, pure and simple, is about choices that other people make. Now, most of the educators that I know don't approve of that choice, and in many, many states, educators have fought very hard to convince their state legislators to put into place fairer and more equitable financing systems. But at least in my experience, though most educators would make different choices, they do take a little comfort in this choice. Why is that? Because once again, it makes the achievement gap not about us, right? It makes it about those policymakers, or again, about the kids and their parents. But the truth of the matter is that most of the most devastating lessons in the education of poor children and children of color flow not from the choices that the policymakers make, but rather from the choices that we educators make. Choices we make, for example, about what to expect of whom? No policymaker, of course, makes us do this. Choices that we make about what to teach to whom? And perhaps the most devastating choice that we make of all, and that, of course, is the choice of who teaches whom. And sadly, when you add up the effects of both sets of choices, both the choices that the policymakers make and the choices that we educators make, the results are simply devastating. Kids who arrive at our doors about this much behind are actually leaving us about this much behind. The gap, in other words, that separates poor kids from middle-class kids and kids of color from white kids actually grows wider and wider and wider the longer they remain with us in school. In fact, I want to show you what it looks like at the end of high school. What I'm doing for you here is graphing the full distribution of mathematics achievement. Those are white 8th graders, African American and Latino 12th graders. As you can see, they are identical. Said differently, what that tells us about where we're at right now as a country. Latino and African American youngsters at the end of high school have skills in mathematics that are indistinguishable from those of white youngsters at the end of middle school. And unfortunately, as you can see here, the same thing is true in reading. Those are white 8th graders, African American, and Latino 12th graders. So in both reading and in mathematics, the two core skills that, as all of us know, are fundamental to accessing any other kind of knowledge, that's where we're at now in the country as a whole. A gap that I suspect you will all agree has enormous significance to the kids themselves in terms of what they're prepared to do when they leave us, but a gap that I suspect you will also agree has enormous significance to a community, to a state, or in fact to a country that is home to differences among groups of that magnitude. I mean, if, as people so often say, schools are what create our community's future, you just look at those lines and ask yourself, what kind of future are we creating? And those numbers would, of course, be terrifying enough if I didn't have to remind you that those are the students who remain in high school through 12th grade to be assessed. What do those numbers look like? Not very pretty either, but add those things up and throw in college entry and college graduation rates, and this is what it looks like at the end of the line. For every 100 white children we start with in our kindergartens nationally, somewhere around 94 or 95 end up with a high school diploma or a GED. Of those, about 66 to 68 or so complete at least a year of college, and somewhere around 34 or 35 end up with at least a bachelor's degree. As you can see here, the numbers for African American youngsters look quite different from that. For every 100 we start with in our kindergartens nationally, only about 18, or 1/2 the rate for white youngsters, end up with that bachelor's degree. Here are the numbers for Latinos. For every 100 we start with in our kindergartens nationally, only somewhere in the 60s even end up with a high school diploma or a GED. Here are the numbers for Native Americans. Now, at least some of you are wondering, what do those college numbers look like? Look purely by family income. This is what that looks like for the country as a whole. If you take American families that are in the top economic quartile, those, by the way, are families with a household incomes $80,000 a year or above, look at their children around age 24 or 25, what you'll learn, as you can see there, is about 75% of those young people have at least a bachelor's degree. But if you look, on the other hand, at American families in the bottom economic quartile, those are families with a household incomes about $25,000 a year or below. Look at their children at that same age. What you'll learn, as you can see there, is only about 9% have a bachelor's degree. Now, we're asked all the time, what are you trying to suggest there? And the answer is really pretty straightforward. What the data suggests is that unless you and I are somehow prepared to argue that children from upper middle and upper income families are more than 8 times as smart as children of the poor, this is about as clear a signal as we have in American education that something's going very seriously wrong in these two systems of ours, K-12 and higher education, because that is precisely the result we're now getting at the end of the line. More than 8 times the results for children from upper middle and upper income families that we're getting for children of the poor. So the question, of course, is what can we do about all that? You know, one of the things that is really important to acknowledge, and I know some of you talk about this in quiet, private spaces, but it's important to say it out loud, is that there are a whole lot of Americans, including, frankly, a whole lot of educators, who basically do not believe that there's anything we can do about the numbers that I just showed you. How do we know that? Because we show them the numbers all the time and say, talk to us. Here's what we hear. No matter where we are in the country, they make exactly the same list. What do you expect? They say the children are poor, their parents somehow don't care, they come to school without an adequate breakfast, they don't speak the right language at home, they live in difficult neighborhoods, they don't have a quiet place to study, a whole list of reasons that is always, always, and only about the kids and their parents. But our question back to them is a pretty simple one, and that is, but wait a second here. If you're right, If, in other words, things like poverty or difficult home circumstances cause low achievement, if those things make low achievement inevitable, how then can it be that very poor kids and kids of color are performing so high in some places? In some schools, for example, we don't have a lot of time for examples, but I want to give you at least a few. And I want to start with this school. This is Capitol View Elementary School in Atlanta. Capitol View is located in one of Atlanta's poorest neighborhoods, a school that exists in kind of shadow of the state capitol. It serves student population that is almost all African American, and 90% of the kids, frankly, aren't just low income. These are very poor kids. And for years and years and years, this school languished near the bottom of the pile in terms of achievement in Georgia. Year after year, results came in, they were at the bottom. One year, however, a new principal arrived at that school. And what was different is not that she didn't see the chaos in the school. She saw it. Not, frankly, that she didn't see the chaos in the neighborhood. She saw that too. But what was different about her is she didn't think it had to be this way. And together with her teachers, they set about making that school, turning that school into what I can only be described as a kind of joyous learning machine. This school knew that the circumstances of these children's lives were such, this is not a school whose results you're going to turn around with a little more drill and practice or a few more ditto sheets. This is a school that needed a curriculum that was rich in not just reading and math, but in science, in history, in music, in culture. So they adopted a curriculum some of you may know called Core Knowledge that leaves literally nothing to chance. Let me show you their results today. These are their results on the Georgia assessment. These results, by the way, put them now in the top 2% of all elementary schools in the entire state of Georgia. Now, some of you are saying to yourselves, well, those proficiency rates might be because Georgia's assessment isn't the toughest in the universe. And those of you from Georgia would probably confirm that's true. So, let me show you how many of their kids get to the highest, the advanced level, what they call exceeding standards in Georgia. These are results for African American kids. In Georgia as a whole, about 18% of African American kids in third grade reading hit the advanced level. Look at Capitol View, 81%. Let me show you mathematics. 19% of low-income kids in Georgia as a whole hit the advanced level. Look at Capitol View, almost half. This is a school that shifted its approach from just teaching to make sure the kids were learning. Look at the results that are possible when you do just that. Let me go to a very different place. Frankfort Elementary School is located in rural Delaware. This school, too, serves a very poor student population, that it's about a third Latino, a third white, a third African American. Most of the children in this school are children of agricultural workers. Mom and dad either work in the fields or work in a nearby chicken processing plant. Frankfort, too, got a lot of bad news for years and years and years. Results that showed them among the lower performing schools in all of Delaware. And for years and years and years, the educators in that school mostly did what educators elsewhere do who serve poor kids, and that is say, what do you expect, right? But one year, one educator in that school said, you know, maybe it's not just the kids. Maybe it's something we're doing. And so they decided as a staff to set out to learn on that. And they decided to focus on literacy. Given the home situation of these schools, they thought that was the right place to start. And they fanned out across the country and learned everything that was possible to learn about good literacy practice. And they infused that throughout their school. Then they took on mathematics and then moved on to science. Let me show you their results today. These are the results on the Delaware State Assessment in 5th grade reading. Here are their results in 5th grade math. Pick another grade. Here's 3rd grade reading compared to the rest of Delaware. 3rd grade math compared to the rest of Delaware. Again, this school still serves the same poor kids. Wildly different results. Wildly different results when they took ownership, again, not just of teaching, but of learning as well. And it's not just elementary schools, by the way. Welcome to Elmont Memorial Junior Senior High School. It's our favorite secondary school in the universe, right? This is a school that serves about 2,000 kids in grades 7 to 12. The vast majority of are African American or Latino. About 9 years ago, a new principal arrived at that school, a gentleman by the name of Al Harper. And Al tells an interesting story. He said, you know, my first day of showing up at work at the front door of this school, I was greeted by my 2 assistant principals who said, "Welcome, Mr. Harper, to one of the best minority high schools in the state of New York." And Al said, you know, as a black man, I said to myself, what does that mean? One of the best minority high schools in the state of New York. Why aren't we one of the best high schools in the state of New York? And that is actually what they set out to become. Now, Al Harper was one heck of a leader. He's now the superintendent of the elementary district that feeds this high school. And his successor as a principal, a gentleman by the name of John Capozzi, is also a terrific principal. But let me be clear here. The real leaders of instructional improvement at this school are the department chairs, the teacher leaders. This high school has one of the most fabulous set of academic department chairs of any high school, or I would argue any college in the country. These teachers care so much about the quality of teaching that goes on, not just in their own classroom, but in every classroom in their departments. They actually think about almost nothing else. And just to give you an image of how this plays out at Elmont, when a new teacher is hired at Elmont, in addition to the observations of that teacher made by the principal and assistant principal, the department chairs make a minimum of 8 one-hour unscheduled observations year 1 and year 2. More important, among them, these teachers have such a finely honed, nuanced understanding of what they should be able to expect of new teachers semester 1, what they should be able to help them do by semester 2, semester 3, and semester 4. That my staff, at least, is convinced that even teachers who would be merely ordinary in other circumstances become superstars in this place. Let me show you their results. These are the results in the New York Regents English exam compared to other high schools in New York State. Here are their results on the New York Regents math exam compared to other high schools in New York State. Unless you think they're getting these results by pushing kids out the door, let me show you their high school graduation rates compared to other high schools in New York State. So don't let anybody ever tell you that what schools do doesn't matter. What you do somehow doesn't matter. What you do turns out to matter big time. I mean big time, and whether kids learn or whether they not. Now, one of the things that people often say to us is, okay, we know you ed trust people, right? You have fabulous, high-performing, high-poverty schools, but you know, those are kind of flukes, the freaks that exist, you know, at the sheer force of some principal's personality. Like other outliers, there's really nothing we can learn from those. When you add it all up to the district level, it really turns out to just be about the kids. You know, we've been wondering, what is it in people's heads that makes them say things like that? What we've come to understand as we listen to educators around the country is there are a whole lot of people who walk around with this idea in their heads that group performance is somehow kind of monolithic. In their minds, African American kids perform kind of down here. Latinos perform sort of like them, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse. And white and Asian kids perform up here. So that your overall performance as a school or as a district or even as a state is mostly a function of how many of each group you have. Right? That's basically what people think. The idea is you've got lots of black kids, lots of Latino kids, or lots of poor kids. Your destiny, therefore, is low achievement. Because, after all, they perform the same no matter where they go to school. That's not even close to true. Even at the district level. One of the first ways we learned that is a bunch of our urban school districts a few years ago agreed to give their kids the same test, the fourth grade reading and 8th grade math exam. So we could look across those districts at the same group of kids and ask the question, do they pretty much perform the same no matter where they go to school? So here's what we learned. What you're looking at there is a performance of low-income black children across those cities. We're going to start by picking on my home school system of Los Angeles. That's a performance of low-income black kids in LA. Let's compare that to the performance of low-income black kids in Charlotte, Houston, New York, or Boston. That gap you're looking at there, that is not a black-white gap. That is, if you will, a gap in the performance of low-income black children in one city and low-income black children in 3 others. And just to give you a sense of its size, almost 2 full grade levels. In other words, by grade 4, low-income black children in Houston, New York, and Boston are reading 2 full grade levels ahead of their counterparts in LA and DC. Let's look at 8th grade math. Low-income black children in LA, low-income black children in Houston, that gap, almost 3 full grade levels. Latinos, LA, Houston, that gap, 2 grade levels. So if you work at the district level and somebody says, what districts do doesn't really matter, show them the data. What districts do matters big time. Look at, we're talking not here about minor, statistically significant but meaningless differences. 2 or 3 grade levels difference is a life-changing difference. So don't let anybody ever tell you what districts do doesn't matter. It sure matters to these kids, and it matters big time. Interestingly, even at the state level, we see whopping differences in what people persist in thinking of as the same group of kids. Let me show you how that plays out. This is 4th grade reading. This is African Americans' performance across the state. State on the left does the best, state on the right does the worst. The difference between best and worst is about 2 grade levels. So let's look at 2 states that have a lot in common. In fact, they share a border, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. An inch of difference between them, wildly different results. Latinos, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Full grade level of difference, okay? Let's look at 8th grade math. We'll look at 2 other states that have much in common in terms of demographics, Texas and California. African American 8th graders in Texas, African American 8th graders in California. That difference, more than a grade level. 8th grade math for Latinos, Texas, California. That gap, closer to 2 grade levels. Bottom line, I hope, is very clear. No matter what level of education you work at the classroom and in school level, at the district level, or at the state level, what you do, what we do as educators, turns out to matter big time. I mean big time, in whether kids learn or whether they don't. So what do we know from the places that are ahead of the rest of us about what it's going to take to both boost overall achievement, but also to close gaps between groups? Let me go very quickly through 7 kind of top-line lessons. Number 1, the schools and districts that really work for all kids, not for just some, succeed by focusing their energy on the things they can do, the things they can change, not by getting overwhelmingly distracted by the things they can't. What do I mean by that? You know, one of the things we've watched is as more and more school districts and states are focusing on closing achievement gaps, it's not unusual for them to start by appointing like a task force on closing the achievement gap. And what happens is all kinds of people come together for the first meeting, and they get butcher paper out and they make a long list of all the things that might possibly contribute to the achievement gap. And then before the second meeting happens, the school district research office goes out and gets data on all those things that people think might somehow be related to the achievement gap, like the number of babies born at low birth weight, the percent of children born to single or undereducated moms, the percent of families receiving public assistance, long list of things. So when the data come in for the second meeting, what happens? People look through pages and pages of overwhelmingly sad data. And what's the result? They feel thoroughly depressed, totally frustrated, and they have no idea what to do. The leaders in high-performing schools and districts don't do that. They don't let that happen, right? They focus like a laser on the things they can change, not on the things they can't. And let me be clear here, these leaders are not naive, right? They're not blind to the ravages of poverty. They know about that. But what they say, as one of my favorite principals, long in Philadelphia, a woman by the name of Barbara Adderley used to say, she said, look, some of our kids live in the most dire circumstances, but we don't dwell on that here. What we do instead is do whatever we have to do to take the kids from wherever they are when they come to us to where they need to go. So it's about focusing on the things you can change, not by being distracted by the others. Speaking of what you can change, schools that really work for poor kids do not leave anything, I mean anything about teaching or learning to chance. What do I mean by that? You and I both know that the overwhelming number, even today, of teachers, even brand new ones, are left pretty much on their own to figure out what to teach, the order in which they should teach it, or most important of all, what's good enough. If I'm a fourth grade teacher, what kind of writing is good enough for that A, B, or C? If I'm a sixth grade teacher, what kind of mathematical understandings are good enough for that A, B, or C? Most of those decisions are left to individual teachers to figure out for themselves. Now, of course, we hand them a copy of the state standards, right? We hand them a textbook or two. But by and large, around what to do tomorrow, they're left pretty much on their own. And what's the result of that? Well, the result, when you add up all those individual decisions made by teachers all around the country, is a system with two primary characteristics. Number one, we don't expect very much of most of our kids. But number two, what we expect of kids differs wildly from classroom to classroom, school to school, and district to district. As you all know, you can have two side-by-side fourth grade teachers in the same hallway with very different definitions in their head of what's good enough for an A, B, or C. You can have two side-by-side Algebra 1 teachers in the same school with very different definitions in their head of what's good enough for that A, B, or C. And when you go beyond that, you look at what they're asking of their students, you see the same patterns. We do a lot of work in classrooms around the country, and basically, when you look at the assignment kids are doing, you get wild differences, even when the topic is the same. Let me give you an example from science. And this is a seventh grade assignment. Okay, you can see the assignment, you can see the content it addresses. Let me show you how, and this is a high poverty school, no surprise. Let me show you how a more affluent school handles that same content. I would guess which school you want your own personal children in. When you have differences like this, you end up with huge outcome differences, not because you taught the same things and kids learn different things, but because we asked very different things of kids. So why is the rigor of assignments so important when we talk about closing the achievement gap? Well, it's pretty clear when you actually start to look at assessment items. This is an item from NAEP. It's on the 8th grade math test. It's an easy item, right? Y'all can figure out the answer in 2 seconds, right? And you look at the data on the kids' answers to this question, and you see some differences by race and economic status, but not many, fairly small gaps. When you move up to a item with sort of medium rigor, okay, you start looking at the data, the gaps are wider, right? Much wider. Move up to a NAEP difficult item, right? Start looking at the data, even wider gaps. So you don't close achievement gaps just by working on the easy stuff. As all of you know, you close achievement gaps by working on both, right? Filling in the basics, moving kids on to higher order stuff. If you've got, in other words, an assignment gap, you're gonna have an achievement gap. So what do high-performing schools and districts do? They don't let any of that happen. They are very clear in advance about what they want their kids to learn, the order in which they should learn it, and kind of rough amounts of time teachers should be spending. They don't leave teachers, especially new teachers, on their own to figure out how to teach those things. They provide lots of curricular supports. They have regular vehicles for teachers who teach same subjects and grade levels to come together. to talk both about the work their kids are doing, but also the assignments they're given, right? Both of those things have to be lined up in order to get better results. They assess students frequently, feed back the data to teachers, and act immediately on the results of those assessments. Nothing magical about that. It's mostly just common sense. But again, it's about leaving none of this to chance. What's the bottom line lesson? As teachers around the country are telling us, it turns out when we actually teach it, most of our kids learn it, right? Much simpler than we thought. Number 3, the schools that really work for poor kids end out, they basically set their goals higher than the ones that don't. I talked to you about Stanton Elementary School in Philadelphia, one of Philly's poorest neighborhoods. You walk through the front door of that school, the first thing you see in the wall is not a poster that says how many kids are proficient on the state assessment, but how many kids are advanced. And Barbara Adderley, the principal, said, you know, we get thousands of educators through this school every year trying to figure out what makes us tick. And she said, they always ask some version of the same question, which is, Barbara, these are poor black children. Why are you focused on advanced? What Barbara says, if we focus on advanced, proficient will take care of itself. Fairly simple idea, right? But very powerful. What's the high school version of that? You all know what's going on in high schools all around the country, right? We're finally reporting honest dropout data, and our response to that as a profession is to collectively freak out, right? So what we're saying is, oh my God, don't push the little babies, don't challenge them, don't make them take tough courses, don't make them take the courses from Mrs. So-and-so because she's harder, right? What we're saying is, don't push them, otherwise our dropout rates will go up. But you know what? Research tells us exactly the opposite. When you look at high schools that both reduce their dropout rates and actually do something to improve student learning, the message is exactly the opposite. That is, the schools that really work don't just aim their kids toward the minimum necessary for a high school diploma, they focus them on college and careers, right? Why is that? Because students have to have a reason to struggle. It has to be connected to their future, and that's what they do. Number 4, higher performing secondary schools don't leave course taking to chance. They put all kids, not just some, in a rigorous and demanding high school curriculum. Why is that? As you all know the research, what we're learning from 20 years of research now is the single biggest predictor of whether students succeed in college or not is not their ACT or SAT score, it is not their rank in class, it is not their GPA, it is the quality and intensity of the high school curriculum. Kids who take a rigorous, challenging high school curriculum succeed no matter what college they go to. Kids who do not have such a curricular experience do not succeed no matter where they go to. But what we're learning is that that same curriculum, which we now know overwhelmingly helps students to succeed in college, also helps with a whole bunch of other things. For starters, even kids who enter high school in the bottom quartile, it turns out, grow more if you put them into a college prep course than if you put them into a remedial course you've designed to catch them up. Why is that? Well, a very good mathematician friend of mine, Uri Treisman, who many of you know, probably has it right when he said, you know why that is? Because we are the only country on earth where people actually believe you can catch kids up by slowing them down. They actually learn more if you put them in a tougher course. Oddly enough, it turns out they actually fail less as well, and they're better prepared whether they go to college or go to work. That's why more and more districts and states are no longer leaving course taking to chance. They're making that curriculum the default curriculum for all of their kids. Number 5, principals are hugely important in high-performing, high-poverty schools. They are ever present, but let me be clear here. They are not the only leaders of their schools. In other words, when I visit high-performing, high-poverty schools, I don't see the same superstar, turn it around by the sheer force of my personality that I see at the conferences. I see regular old people, people like you, people like me, regular people who they don't have those big outsized personalities. What they do have is a very tight focus on results. They're relentless about the need for improvement, but they are not the only leaders in their school. In high-performing schools, teachers in particular have regular opportunities to observe other teachers. They have the time to plan and work together. Teachers in particular take on leadership tasks in instructional improvement at the school. Speaking of teachers, good schools don't just mouth the mantra, teachers matter more than anything else. They actually act like teachers matter. And it turns out there's a very big difference between mouthing the mantra and actually acting like teachers matter. Why is that important? Well, you all, I suspect, know the research. What we're learning now from more than a decade of research is that there are much bigger differences amongst our teachers in their ability to take kids from wherever they are when they enter a classroom and grow their knowledge and skills than we ever knew. In just 1 year, there are whopping differences in the amount of growth that occurs across different classrooms. And those differences, by the way, are biggest for kids who start initially on the low end. What we're also learning, though, is that those differences accumulate. Kids who have 3 strong teachers in a row literally soar, no matter what their family background. When kids have 2 weak teachers in a row, you see a permanent impact on their later achievement. So teachers matter more than anything else. But remember what I showed you earlier, right? Are strong teachers evenly distributed across all kinds of kids? Not even close. And that is true, by the way, no matter how you measure teacher qualifications, right? Whether you measure it by in and out of field, whether you measure it by experience, or whether you're in a state like Tennessee, you can actually identify who your strongest teachers are, who your weakest teachers are. Basically, the pattern nationally is exactly the same. Basically, what we do in this country is we take the kids who are most dependent upon their teachers for academic learning, and what do? We systematically assign them to teachers with the weakest ability to do that. And then when they don't perform so well on our test, again, what do? We blame it on the kids and their parents. We never talk about what we've done. In high-performing schools and districts, they don't let these things happen. They work very hard, not just to attract, but to hold strong teachers. They make sure their strongest teachers don't just teach the high-end kids, but also teach the kids who most need their expertise. And frankly, in successful high-poverty schools, both the teachers and the principals care so much about quality teaching that they collectively chase out teachers who they think are not good enough for our kids. So it's about not just saying that teachers matter, it's about acting like they matter. Why is this so important? Very simple. Years now of research are telling us that if you care about closing the achievement gap, you have to be about closing the teacher quality gap. Why? Because if we could but assure low-income kids were assigned a sequence of 5 highly effective teachers in a row, we could, look at the language there, not narrow a little bit, not shrink a little bit. We could completely close the gap in achievement that separates poor kids from others. Finally, in good systems, leaders of all sorts, teacher leaders, administrative leaders, community leaders, are absolutely aggressive about tackling the myth that closing the achievement gap is somehow unfair and unachievable. Now look, the truth of the matter is, it may be unfair to ask educators to do this alone. We all know that if ours were the country that really lived up to its ideals, we sure as heck would not be allowing so many of our children to live in such desperate circumstances and then say to the school people, well, you just have to take care of the effects of this. We wouldn't do that. So it may be unfair, but it is not unachievable. The kids in the slides that I'm about to show you as I close are some of the lucky kids. Though all of them are poor, they actually live on the high end of the achievement gap, not its ugly bottom. Why is that? Because these children have the great good fortune to attend some of the schools that I talked with you about this morning, and other schools like them around the country. These kids, in other words, are the lucky ones. But let's remember, most of the children who look like these children are not nearly so lucky. They live on the bottom side of the achievement gap, not because they couldn't learn, but because all too often we didn't even bother to try. Turning that around is the most important agenda for us as a country, and certainly for us as a profession. That's why what all of you do is so hugely important to the children you serve, but also to the very future of your communities, your states, and our country. So thank you, thank you, thank you for what you do.